The crimson dust swirled endlessly across the barren landscape of Kepler 442b, a world that seemed designed by the universe itself to test the limits of survival. Dr. Zara Veleth pressed her back against the corroded metal of her crashed research vessel, watching the twin suns set through the perpetual haze of atmospheric storms. The violet sky bled into deeper purples as night approached, bringing with it the predators that made this planet a graveyard for the unprepared. 6 months. 6 months since the Galactic Research Council's expedition had gone catastrophically wrong. What was supposed to be a routine xenobiology survey had become a nightmare when solar flares disrupted their navigation systems, sending their ship careening into this hostile world's atmosphere. Of the 12-member crew, only Zara remained alive, and even that was a generous assessment of her current state. Her emergency supplies had run dangerously low weeks ago. The protein synthesizers had failed after the 3rd month, forcing her to subsist on whatever edible flora she could identify using her remaining scanner equipment. The water reclamation system still functioned, barely, filtering the planet's acidic groundwater into something that wouldn't immediately dissolve her internal organs. But the real threat wasn't hunger or thirst, it was the creatures that emerged after dark. The indigenous life forms of Kepler 442b had evolved in ways that defied conventional xenobiological understanding. Crystalline predators that could phase through solid matter, hunting in packs with coordinated telepathic communication. Serpentine entities that burrowed through the hardened regolith, emerging without warning to drag prey into subterranean lairs. Most terrifying of all were the void wraiths, shadow-like beings that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime, immune to energy weapons and capable of inducing madness in their victims through some form of psychic interference. Zara had learned to fear the darkness on this world in ways she never thought possible. During her years studying xenobiology across 17 different star systems, she had encountered dangerous species before, but nothing like this. The creatures here didn't just hunt for sustenance, they seemed to derive some perverse satisfaction from the terror of their prey, often toying with victims for hours before delivering the killing blow. Her multi-band communicator crackled with static as she performed her nightly maintenance routine. For 6 months, she had broadcast on every conceivable frequency, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, might pick up her distress signal. The Galactic Research Council would have marked their expedition as lost by now, but rescue missions to uncharted worlds were expensive and dangerous. Cost-benefit analyses rarely favored individual survivors, especially on planets as hostile as Kepler 442b. The temperature began its nightly plunge as the twin suns disappeared below the horizon. Zara activated her thermal suit's heating elements, careful to conserve the dwindling power cells. The suit had been designed for short-term exploration, not extended survival, and its systems were failing one by one. The environmental seals leaked slightly, allowing the planet's corrosive atmosphere to slowly eat away at the fabric. The heads-up display flickered intermittently, displaying sensor readings that became less reliable each day. As the first stars became visible through the atmospheric haze, Zara heard the familiar sound that made her blood freeze, the crystalline chiming that announced the emergence of the nocturnal predators. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, a harmonic resonance that vibrated through the very bones of anyone unlucky enough to hear it. She quickly sealed herself inside the makeshift shelter she had constructed from salvaged hull plating, knowing that the thin metal walls provided only psychological comfort against creatures that could phase through solid matter at will. The first attack came within minutes of full darkness. Shadows moved beyond the corrugated walls of her shelter, accompanied by the scraping sound of claws against metal. The void wraiths had found her again, as they did most nights, drawn by some quality of her alien mind that seemed to intrigue them. They would circle the shelter for hours, sometimes manifesting partially into normal space to test her defenses, retreating when her makeshift energy barriers activated. Zara had learned not to look directly at them. The few times she had made that mistake, the psychic feedback had left her unconscious for hours, vulnerable to any predator that might have discovered her hiding place. Instead, she focused on her breathing exercises, techniques learned during her doctoral studies on Rigel 7, where meditation was considered essential for maintaining mental clarity in high-stress research environments. The attacks continued throughout the night, as they had for months. Sometimes the creatures would test different approaches, the crystalline predators attempting to phase through her barriers at various frequencies, the burrowing serpents emerging from the ground beneath her shelter only to find the reinforced floor plating too difficult to penetrate quickly. Each assault taught Zara something new about her tormentors, knowledge that had helped her survive this long but seemed insufficient for long-term survival. As dawn approached and the nocturnal predators retreated to whatever dimensions or underground lairs they inhabited during daylight hours, Zara emerged from her shelter to assess the night's damage. The energy barriers had held, but the power drain was becoming unsustainable. Her portable fusion cell showed less than 30% charge remaining, and there was no way to recharge it without access to proper facilities. The morning ritual began as it had for 6 months. First, a careful inspection of her water collection system, several cloth tarps arranged to capture moisture from the planet's frequent acid rain, feeding into a filtration unit salvaged from the crashed ship's life support systems. The yield was always disappointingly low, barely enough to meet minimum hydration requirements. Next came foraging for edible vegetation. The planet's flora was sparse and mostly toxic, but Zara had identified several species that could be consumed in small quantities without immediate adverse effects. The long-term consequences of her makeshift diet were unknown, but starvation was a more immediate concern than potential carcinogenic compounds or vitamin deficiencies. Her scientific training proved invaluable during these morning expeditions. Years of fieldwork had taught her to observe patterns, to notice small changes in the environment that might indicate danger or opportunity. The way certain plants wilted when predators passed nearby. The distinct mineral composition of soil that indicated underground water sources. The atmospheric pressure fluctuations that preceded the violent storms that could level anything not properly secured. But, perhaps most importantly, her training had taught her to maintain detailed records. Even in her current desperate circumstances, Zara continued documenting her observations in a digital journal stored on her personal tablet. The device's hardened casing had survived the crash, and its extended battery life meant it might outlast her own survival. If rescue ever came, or if her body was eventually discovered, the data might prove valuable to future expeditions. The journal entries had evolved over the months from scientific observations to something approaching a personal memoir. Early entries focused on taxonomic classifications of local species, atmospheric readings, and geological surveys. Recent entries were more introspective, exploring the psychological challenges of extended isolation and the gradual erosion of hope that came with each passing day. Today's entry would note the continuing deterioration of her equipment and the increasingly aggressive behavior of the nocturnal predators. They seemed to be learning from each failed attack, adapting their strategies in ways that suggested a collective intelligence far more sophisticated than individual hunting instincts. The implications were troubling. If the creatures could learn and adapt, her current defensive measures might eventually prove inadequate. The twin suns climbed higher into the violet sky, bringing with them the oppressive heat that made daytime exploration dangerous for different reasons. The atmosphere's composition created a greenhouse effect that could raise surface temperatures to lethal levels during peak solar exposure. Zara's thermal suit could provide cooling as well as heating, but the energy requirements were enormous, forcing her to limit daytime activities to the early morning and late afternoon hours. She was collecting water samples from a new mineral spring when her communicator suddenly crackled with something other than static. For a moment, she thought it might be another equipment malfunction. The device had been generating false signals with increasing frequency as its components degraded. But then, she heard something that made her heart race, a structured transmission, definitely artificial, definitely intelligent. The signal was faint and intermittent, broken by atmospheric interference and what might have been distance. But the underlying pattern was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was broadcasting on emergency frequencies. Zara fumbled with her communicator's controls, trying to boost the reception and lock onto the signal's source. Her hands shook with excitement and desperation as she fine-tuned the frequency modulation. They're clearer now, though still fragmented. It was definitely a distress beacon, but the transmission protocol was unfamiliar. Not Galactic Research Council standard, not any of the major commercial spacefaring organizations she knew. The signal strength suggested the source was somewhere on the planet's surface, possibly another crash survivor from a different expedition. For the first time in months, Zara felt something approaching hope. Another survivor would mean shared resources, shared knowledge, and, perhaps most importantly, shared survival strategies. Two minds working together could solve problems that had seemed impossible for one person alone. But it could also mean competition for limited resources, or worse, what if the other survivor was from a hostile species or criminal organization? The signal seemed to be coming from approximately 30 kilometers to the north, beyond a range of crystalline formations that Zara had never dared to explore. The area was known to be heavily populated by the phasing predators during daylight hours, making it effectively impassable for someone with her limited defensive capabilities. But the alternative, continuing her slow death by attrition on this hostile world, was hardly more appealing. She spent the remainder of the day preparing for what might be her final expedition. If she was going to attempt reaching the signal's source, she would need to carry everything essential for extended survival. Her shelter could be rebuilt if she survived, but critical equipment like the water purification system and remaining power cells could not be replaced. The decision to leave her relatively secure base camp was not made lightly. For 6 months, this small area of defensible terrain had been her entire world, a tiny island of marginal safety in an ocean of lethal hostility. Abandoning it felt like abandoning the last vestiges of rational caution, but rationality itself demanded acknowledging that her current situation was unsustainable. As the twin suns set once again, painting the crystalline formations in brilliant shades of amber and rose, Zara made her final preparations. Tomorrow, she would either find salvation in the form of another survivor, or she would die attempting to reach them. Either outcome seemed preferable to the slow dissolution of mind and body that awaited her if she remained in place. The nocturnal predators emerged as expected, their crystalline chiming filling the air with harmonics that seemed to resonate in her very bones. But tonight, Zara listened to their calls with different ears. Instead of the sound of death approaching, she heard the voice of a world that had tested her limits and found her somehow worthy of survival. She had endured 6 months of this planet's worst efforts to kill her, adapting and learning with each assault. Tomorrow would test whether her adaptation had been sufficient. Whether the woman who had crashed on this world 6 months ago, a sheltered academic with theoretical knowledge but no practical survival experience, had truly become someone capable of surviving against impossible odds. Whether Dr. Zara Veleth, xenobiologist, had become Zara the survivor. The question that would determine her fate was deceptively simple: had she destroyed her weak self completely enough to become someone who could never be destroyed by external forces? The crystalline predators continued their haunting chorus as she contemplated the answer, and, for the first time in months, Zara found herself smiling as she listened to their song. The journey north began before dawn, when the nocturnal predators had retreated and the diurnal hunters had not yet emerged from their crystalline lairs. Zara moved with practiced efficiency through the scarred landscape, her movements economical and purposeful in ways that would have surprised her former colleagues. The anxious academic who had once required detailed safety briefings before stepping onto any unexplored world had been replaced by someone who navigated deadly terrain with instinctive awareness. Her pack contained everything essential for survival: the portable water purification unit, her last functioning power cells, emergency rations that would last perhaps 3 days, basic medical supplies, and her personal tablet with its precious cargo of scientific observations. The weight distribution was carefully calculated to maintain mobility while ensuring she could survive independently if she became separated from her base camp permanently. The crystalline formations grew larger and more complex as she traveled north, their faceted surfaces refracting the early morning sunlight into spectacular displays of rainbow light. But Zara had learned to appreciate beauty and danger simultaneously on this world. The same crystal structures that created such magnificent optical effects also served as hunting grounds for predators that could phase through matter, emerging without warning from what appeared to be solid stone. Her route took her through a network of narrow canyons carved by millennia of acid rain and seismic activity. The walls rose several hundred meters on either side, their surfaces scored with deep grooves that might have been natural erosion or the claw marks of creatures too large to contemplate. Moving through these confined spaces required constant vigilance. The confined environment limited escape routes if predators emerged, but it also provided shelter from the atmospheric storms that could materialize without warning. The distress signal grew stronger as she traveled, confirming that she was moving in the correct direction. More importantly, the signal pattern was becoming clearer, revealing subtle characteristics that suggested its source was not another Galactic Research Council expedition. The modulation frequency and encryption protocols were unfamiliar, possibly indicating contact with an entirely different spacefaring civilization. By midday, the twin suns had reached their peak intensity, forcing Zara to seek shelter in a shallow cave system carved into the canyon wall. The cave provided blessed relief from the heat, but also presented new dangers. Subterranean predators used similar formations as nesting sites, and disturbing them during their dormancy periods could trigger aggressive defensive responses. She used the enforced rest period to study her surroundings more carefully, applying the observational skills that had made her a respected xenobiologist before this ordeal began. The cave walls showed signs of recent habitation, not by indigenous creatures, but by something that had used tools to modify the natural formation. Smooth cuts in the stone where handholds had been carved. Fire-blackened areas that might have served as cooking sites. Most intriguing of all, crude symbols scratched into the rock face in patterns that suggested linguistic meaning. The symbols were unlike anything in Zara's extensive knowledge of galactic writing systems. They were angular and economical, conveying complex information with minimal strokes. Some appeared to be pictographic representations of local predators, while others might have been maps or technical diagrams. The style suggested someone with limited time and tools, working under difficult circumstances to leave important information for others who might follow. As she studied the markings more closely, Zara began to discern a pattern that made her pulse quicken. The symbols weren't just random observations, they were a systematic catalog of predator behavior patterns, hunting schedules, and defensive strategies. Someone else had been studying the indigenous life forms with scientific rigor, documenting their findings in the only medium available. But who? The precision and methodology suggested someone with advanced scientific training, but the primitive nature of the recording medium indicated someone operating under extreme resource constraints. Another crash survivor from a different expedition? A previous explorer who had somehow survived long enough to conduct extended observations? The afternoon hours passed slowly as Zara waited for the surface temperatures to become manageable again. She used the time productively, copying the cave symbols into her digital journal and attempting to decode their meaning through linguistic analysis techniques. The work provided welcome intellectual stimulation after months of focusing purely on immediate survival needs. As the twin suns began their descent toward the horizon, Zara emerged from the cave system to continue her journey northward. The distress signal was now strong enough to triangulate with reasonable precision. Its source lay perhaps 10 kilometers ahead, in an area where the crystalline formations gave way to a vast plain of fused glass created by some ancient cataclysmic event. The glass plain presented unique challenges for navigation. The surface was relatively smooth, allowing for faster travel, but it also provided no natural shelter or concealment. Any predators in the area would spot her from considerable distances, and the reflective properties of the fused glass could create optical illusions that made accurate navigation difficult. Worse, the glass retained heat from the twin suns throughout the night, creating an environment that remained dangerously hot long after sunset. But the signal was definitely coming from somewhere on that plain, and Zara had already committed to this course of action. Turning back now would accomplish nothing except ensuring a slower death by attrition. She activated her thermal suit's cooling systems and began the trek across the glass wasteland, moving as quickly as possible while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. The landscape here was utterly alien in ways that transcended mere biological differences. The fused glass had been formed by temperatures that could only be achieved by stellar-class energy releases, suggesting that this world had witnessed events far more catastrophic than simple volcanic activity or meteor impacts. Whatever had created this glass plane had been powerful enough to transform solid rock into a mirror-smooth surface that stretched beyond the horizon. As night fell, the glass beneath her feet began to glow with residual heat, creating an otherworldly environment where the distinction between ground and sky became increasingly difficult to determine. The stars overhead reflected endlessly in the surface below, making it seem as though she was walking through space itself. The effect was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The nocturnal predators seemed less active on the glass plane, possibly deterred by the residual heat or the lack of suitable hiding places. But their absence only made Zara more nervous. In her months on this world, she had learned that apparent safety often preceded the most dangerous encounters. The indigenous life forms were constantly evolving new hunting strategies, and empty terrain might simply indicate the presence of predators she hadn't yet learned to detect. The distress signal reached full strength near midnight, leading her to a section of the glass plane where the surface had been shattered by some tremendous impact. Fragments of crystalline material lay scattered in patterns that suggested an explosion or crash landing, but the debris was unlike anything from known spacecraft designs. The fragments were too regular to be natural crystal formations, yet too organic in appearance to be manufactured technology. And there, in the center of the impact crater, she found him. The figure sat cross-legged beside a small fire built from materials she couldn't immediately identify, his silhouette outlined against the flames in a way that suggested complete comfort with his surroundings. He appeared to be human bipedal, appropriate proportions, wearing what might have been military-style clothing adapted for harsh environmental conditions. But humans were not supposed to be in this sector of the galaxy, and certainly not surviving alone on worlds like Kepler 442b. As she approached the crater's edge, the figure looked up and spoke in a language she recognized as Standard Galactic, though heavily accented in ways that suggested a non-standard linguistic background. "You've been tracking my beacon for 12 hours, he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance despite its conversational tone. "Took longer than I expected, but, then, again, you're carrying a lot of unnecessary equipment for someone who's been surviving alone for 6 months. Zara froze, her mind struggling to process multiple impossible elements simultaneously. How had he known she was approaching? How could he have been tracking her movements? And, most importantly, how had he survived long enough on this world to speak with such casual confidence about its dangers? "Who are you?" she called out, maintaining what she hoped was a safe distance while evaluating potential escape routes. Her experiences on Kepler 442b had taught her to assume that anything unexpected was probably dangerous. The figure stood with fluid grace, and she could see that her initial assessment had been correct. He was definitely human, though his modifications to standard survival gear showed innovations she hadn't considered. His thermal suit appeared to be extensively modified, incorporating elements that might have been salvaged from local materials. Most striking were his eyes, which reflected the firelight with an intensity that suggested either genetic modification or cybernetic enhancement. "Name's Marcus Chen," he said, moving around the fire with movements that reminded her of the predators she had spent months evading. "Economical, purposeful, and absolutely without wasted motion. Formerly Staff Sergeant, Earth Colonial Marines. Currently what you might call a long-term visitor to this particular corner of hell. Earth Colonial Marines." Zara's mind reeled as she tried to reconcile this information with her understanding of galactic geography and politics. Earth was supposedly located far from any established trade routes, its inhabitants barely capable of interplanetary travel, let alone expeditions to uncharted worlds in distant sectors. Yet here was someone claiming military service with an Earth-based organization, surviving on a world that had killed 11 of her highly trained research colleagues. "That's impossible," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she realized how inadequate they were. Nothing about her survival on this world should have been possible according to her original understanding of the situation. Marcus smiled, and the expression somehow managed to be both reassuring and predatory. "Impossible is a word that gets redefined pretty quickly on worlds like this one," he said. "What matters isn't what should be possible, it's what you're willing to do to make survival happen." He gestured toward the scattered crystalline fragments around the impact crater. "This is what's left of my drop pod. Not exactly a gentle landing, but it got me here alive, which is more than most people can say about Kepler 442b. The question is, what are you willing to do to stay alive?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond mere survival strategies. Zara realized that this moment represented a fundamental choice point in her ordeal. She could maintain her cautious, scientific approach to the situation, treating this encounter as another data point to be carefully analyzed before drawing conclusions. Or she could accept that her months of solitary survival had changed her in ways that demanded new approaches to impossible situations. "I've been willing to do whatever it takes to survive," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "For 6 months, I've adapted, learned, and endured things that should have killed me. I'm still here." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Shows you've already started the process of becoming someone who can't be destroyed by external circumstances. But there's more to it than just surviving, there's choosing who you become in the process." He moved to the edge of the crater, his movements demonstrating the same predatory grace she had noticed earlier. The thing about worlds like this one is that they don't just test your physical survival skills. They test whether you can destroy the weak parts of yourself completely enough to become something that external forces can't break. Have you figured out what you're really made of yet? The question struck her with unexpected force. For 6 months, she had been focused on the immediate challenges of staying alive, finding food, avoiding predators, maintaining essential equipment. But Marcus was asking about something deeper, something that went to the core of identity itself. "I'm not the same person who crashed here 6 months ago," she said slowly, working through the implications as she spoke. "That person would have died in the first week. She was too dependent on systems, too afraid of taking necessary risks, too attached to the illusion of safety." "And who are you now?" Marcus asked, his enhanced eyes studying her with an intensity that felt like being evaluated by one of the indigenous predators. Zara considered the question seriously, drawing on the experiences that had transformed her from an academic researcher into someone capable of surviving against impossible odds. The answer, when it came, surprised her with its clarity. "Someone who makes the darkness afraid," she said, and knew as she spoke that the words were true. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his cybernetically enhanced eyes processing information in ways that went beyond normal human perception. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality of recognition that suggested he had found something he had been searching for. "Someone who makes the darkness afraid," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's not something you learn from textbooks or training simulations. That's something you become through choices made when everything else has been stripped away." He gestured for her to join him beside the fire, and, after a moment's hesitation, Zara descended into the crater. Up close, she could see that Marcus's modifications extended beyond simple gear adaptations. His thermal suit incorporated crystalline fragments that seemed to pulse with their own internal light, and his weapons were unlike anything she had seen in standard military configurations. Everything about him suggested someone who had not merely adapted to this world's challenges, but had fundamentally integrated with them. "How long have you been here?" she asked, settling cross-legged across the fire from him. The position felt natural in ways that would have surprised her 6 months ago, another sign of how completely she had shed her former academic formality. 3 years, 7 months, 12 days, Marcus replied without hesitation. "But who's counting? The thing about time on worlds like this is that it stops being about duration and starts being about transformation. I've lived more in the last 3 years than in the previous 30. 3 years. Zara tried to process the implications of surviving that long on Kepler 442b, but the number seemed almost meaningless. Her 6 months had felt like a lifetime of constant adaptation and evolution. What would 3 years of such transformation produce? "Your ship?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Gone," Marcus confirmed. "Not a crash like yours, deliberate destruction. Sometimes the only way forward is to burn the bridges behind you, make sure there's no possibility of retreat. Forces you to find solutions you never would have considered if you thought you had safer options." The concept was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Deliberately cutting off all escape routes, committing completely to survival in an impossible environment. It went against every principle of risk management she had learned in her scientific training, yet she could see the logic. Half measures and backup plans might actually impede the radical adaptation necessary for long-term survival. "Why?" she asked. "What brought you here in the first place?" Marcus smiled, and this time the expression was entirely human, tired, somewhat sad, but with an underlying satisfaction that spoke of hard-won peace with difficult decisions. "Same thing that brings most humans to places like this," he said. "Running from something, running toward something, or running because standing still means dying slowly. In my case, all three." He added what appeared to be crystalline material to the fire, causing the flames to shift to brilliant blues and purples that cast strange shadows on the crater walls. "Earth colonial marines don't officially operate in this sector," he continued. "But there are unofficial operations, black projects designed to test human adaptability in extreme environments. Volunteers only, and the volunteer part is important. You can't force this kind of transformation." "Transformation into what?" Zara asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. Into something that can survive anywhere, under any circumstances, Marcus replied. Humans have a particular gift for adaptation, but most of us never discover it because we never face circumstances extreme enough to trigger the process. Worlds like Kepler 442b are laboratories for finding out what we're really capable of becoming. The implications were staggering. If Marcus was telling the truth, then her survival on this world wasn't just a matter of individual resilience, it was part of a larger pattern of human capability that most of her species never had occasion to discover. The scientific implications alone were revolutionary, but the personal implications were even more profound. The question you asked earlier, she said slowly, working through the connections. About whether I figured out what I'm really made of, that wasn't just philosophical, was it? Marcus shook his head. Everything about human survival in extreme environments comes down to a single choice. Are you willing to completely destroy the weak parts of yourself to become something that external forces can't destroy? Most people aren't. They hold on to who they used to be, try to maintain familiar patterns of thought and behavior even when those patterns are actively killing them. He stood and moved to one of the crystalline fragments scattered around the crater, running his fingers along its surface in ways that suggested intimate familiarity. These aren't just rocks, he said. They're a form of crystallized consciousness left behind by the original inhabitants of this world. The predators you've been fighting aren't just animals, they're fragments of a dying civilization's collective mind, trying to understand what happened to their world. The revelation recontextualized everything Zara had experienced over the past 6 months. The coordinated hunting patterns, the apparent intelligence behind predator behavior, the way they seemed more interested in studying her than simply killing her, it all made sense if they were actually remnants of a once sapient species. The caves with the symbols, she said, sudden understanding dawning. You left those. Some of them, Marcus confirmed. But not all. The original inhabitants left records too, encoded in ways that become readable once you've adapted enough to understand their perspective. That's the real test of survival on worlds like this, not just staying alive, but evolving enough to comprehend the deeper patterns. He returned to the fire, his movements now carrying an almost ritualistic quality. Which brings us to the choice you have to make, he said. I can teach you what I've learned, show you techniques that will not only ensure your survival but transform you into something far beyond what you were when you arrived here. But the process requires abandoning everything familiar about human identity and accepting transformation that can't be reversed. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an abyss. Zara could see the implications clearly. Marcus was offering her not just survival, but evolution into something that transcended normal human limitations. But at the cost of becoming something that might no longer be recognizably human in any conventional sense. What's the alternative? She asked, though she suspected she already knew. Continue as you are, Marcus said simply. You've adapted enough to survive for a while longer, maybe even long enough for a rescue mission to find you. Return to your old life, your old identity, your old limitations. Pretend this never happened and go back to being who you used to be. But even as he spoke the words, Zara knew they weren't really true. There was no going back to who she had been 6 months ago. That person was gone, destroyed by necessity and reborn through choices made in extremity. The only real question was whether to continue that transformation or try to freeze it at its current state. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, she said, remembering the phrase that had been echoing in her mind since the beginning of this ordeal. That's not just about physical survival, is it? It's about choosing who to become when everything external is trying to kill you. Marcus nodded approvingly. Most humans never get the opportunity to discover what they're really made of because their environments are too safe, too predictable. They live their entire lives operating from maybe 10% of their actual capabilities. Worlds like this strip away the illusion that safety comes from external systems and force you to find the strength that was always there. The twin suns had set while they talked, and the familiar sounds of nocturnal predators were beginning to echo across the glass plain. But, for the first time in 6 months, Zara didn't feel the automatic surge of fear that had become her conditioned response to darkness on this world. Instead, she felt curiosity. What would these creatures teach her about herself if she approached them as opportunities for growth rather than threats to be avoided? "You're not afraid anymore," Marcus observed, watching her face in the firelight. "I'm terrified," Zara corrected. "But the fear isn't about dying, it's about not becoming everything I could be. That's a different kind of fear entirely, and it leads to different choices." She stood and moved to the crater's edge, looking out across the glass plain where crystalline predators were beginning to emerge for their nightly hunt. Their chiming calls filled the air, but tonight they sounded like music rather than death songs. "Teach me," she said, turning back to Marcus. "Show me what humans are really capable of becoming." Marcus smiled, and this time the expression was pure approval. "The first lesson is the hardest one," he said. "Everything you think you know about human limitations is wrong. Everything you've been taught about what's possible for our species is the product of environments too safe to trigger our real capabilities." He moved to join her at the crater's edge, his enhanced vision tracking predator movements that were invisible to her unmodified eyes. "Humans weren't designed for safe environments," he continued. "We were designed for places like this, worlds that force us to transcend every limitation, overcome every obstacle, and become something that can't be broken by external circumstances." As if summoned by his words, a pack of crystalline predators crested the ridge surrounding their position. But, instead of preparing for defensive action, Marcus stepped forward with movements that somehow conveyed challenge rather than threat. The lead predator paused, its multifaceted form refracting the firelight in patterns that might have been communication. "The second lesson," Marcus said without taking his eyes off the approaching creatures, "is that predators and prey are roles, not identities. Which role you play in any given situation is a choice, not a predetermined fate." The lead predator moved closer, its crystalline form shifting through phases of matter in ways that defied conventional physics. But Marcus stood his ground, his posture conveying the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from complete certainty about one's capabilities. "What are you doing?" Zara whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process the apparent impossibility of what she was witnessing. "Establishing dominance," Marcus replied calmly. "These creatures respect strength, but they define strength differently than most humans understand it. Physical power means nothing to beings that can phase through matter. What they respond to is psychological force, the kind of absolute certainty that comes from having destroyed every weak part of yourself." The predator stopped just meters away, its form solidifying into something approaching normal matter. This close, Zara could see that its crystalline structure was incredibly complex, with layers of organization that suggested intelligence far beyond simple predatory instincts. Marcus extended his hand toward the creature, and, after a moment of apparent consideration, it moved forward to investigate. The contact between human flesh and alien crystal produced a flash of light that illuminated the entire crater, and, when Zara's vision cleared, both Marcus and the predator appeared to be surrounded by the same subtle luminescence. "The third lesson," Marcus said, his voice now carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before, "is that consciousness is far more adaptable than most humans imagine. When you stop thinking of yourself as a fixed entity and start thinking of yourself as a process of continuous transformation, entirely new forms of existence become possible." The other predators had approached during this exchange, forming a circle around the crater but showing no signs of aggressive intent. Their crystalline forms pulsed with synchronized rhythms that created complex interference patterns in the air, a form of communication that operated on frequencies beyond normal human perception. "They're not trying to hunt us," Zara realized with sudden clarity. "They're trying to understand us. They've been studying human behavior the same way we study alien life forms." "Exactly," Marcus confirmed. "But, more than that, they're evaluating whether we've adapted enough to be worthy of integration with their collective consciousness. The original inhabitants of this world didn't die out, they transcended physical existence and became something that operates on entirely different principles." The implications struck Zara with the force of revelation. The predators, the hostile environment, the constant pressure that had forced her to adapt and evolve, it had all been a test. Not a test of survival skills, but a test of consciousness itself. A test of whether human awareness was flexible enough to transcend the limitations of individual identity and become part of something larger. "The choice," she said, understanding flooding through her. It's not just about personal transformation. It's about whether humans are ready to evolve beyond biological limitations entirely. Marcus nodded. Some of us are, he said. The question is whether you're one of them. Zara looked around the crater at the assembled predators, seeing them now not as threats but as potential teachers, guides to forms of existence she had never imagined possible. The fear that had dominated her experience on this world was still present, but it had transformed into something else, the exhilarating terror of standing at the edge of unprecedented evolution. I destroyed my weak self to survive, she said, her voice carrying new harmonics that resonated with the crystal and beings around them. But I can destroy what I've become to transcend survival entirely. The lead predator moved closer, its form beginning to shift in ways that suggested preparation for some form of merging or integration. Marcus extended his other hand toward Zara, creating a connection between human and alien consciousness that pulsed with possibilities she was only beginning to comprehend. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Marcus said, his words echoing with the authority of someone who had tested the principle to its ultimate limits. But the human who destroys the limitations of self can become something that transcends the very concept of destruction. Zara reached out and grasped his hand, feeling the flow of consciousness that connected him to the crystalline beings and, through them, to the transformed awareness that had once been this world's original inhabitants. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced, not the loss of individual identity, but its expansion into something vast and multifaceted and utterly beyond the boundaries she had once accepted as permanent. As the integration began, her last thought as a purely human consciousness was wonder at how completely wrong she had been about the limitations of her species. Humans weren't just capable of surviving in impossible environments, they were capable of evolving beyond the very concepts that define environmental impossibility. The woman who had crashed on Kepler 442b 6 months ago was gone, destroyed by necessity and choice. The survivor who had endured months of hostile predators was gone, transcended by the discovery of possibilities beyond survival. What remained was something new, something that had never existed before, a hybrid consciousness that combined human adaptability with alien wisdom, individual will with collective knowledge, biological heritage with crystalline transcendence. And, in that transformation, Zara finally understood the true meaning of the phrase that had guided her through her darkest moments. The destruction of weakness wasn't just about becoming strong enough to resist external forces, it was about becoming so fundamentally transformed that the very concepts of external and internal, self and other, human and alien, became obsolete. She had found her answer to the ultimate question of human potential. And the answer was that there were no ultimate questions, only eternal transformations waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to destroy everything they thought they knew about the possible.